just before we start, there's a couple of comments. The cockle shell heroes, that immediately evokes something. There's a gentleman sitting in the back of the room. It is a friend of the son of Blondie Hasler, who was Colonel Blondie Hasler, was one of the people, cockle shell heroes, who many of us know was also the fellow that sailed a folk boat single-handed across the Atlantic in the 50s. So Lars Ronning back there knows some connections. He's also Norwegian, so he knows about the fairing as well, and we have many different things. We've got experts in Northwest Haida canoes, and so I think we've got a good audience here. The other thing, too, in terms of multiple things, I just recently reread the Cook's Voyages in the North Pacific, and he talks a lot about high-volume bodaikas, normally 2- and 3-person boats. They put 6 or 7, and he talks of one voyage between 2 of the Aleutian or 3 of the Aleutian Islands where he rode below deck, tucked in, while the others, which I think must be kind of scary, be riding that way. But I think this is an exciting area. Anyway, I am now pinch hitting for Chris Barry with another example, I think, where we've seen an evolutionary process that actually produced a very efficient vessel that you can still see on the West Coast today. Where am I going here? Come on, next one. And those of you know Chris, I'm not going to try to sing the thing, but basically, I think a lot of us as naval architects, although I would say we're not scientists by and large, there's a science component to it, but I think a lot of why we're naval architects and not engineers is there is an art to it, and nobody wants an ugly boat. So, and I think we all have different different ways of judging what's beautiful, and we've seen some already today. We've got some examples, but I would say that the San Francisco West Coast boats, the Monterey Clippers, fall in that category. Their origins were basically the Luca, the Dago boat, which was a Mediterranean vessel. We'll talk a little about that, and so we'll go through some of the events and how they moved from a sailing vessel to a powered vessel. And we actually see in several indigenous craft some interesting things, because the propulsion system affected the design. They were definitely married, and you can see very clearly from my part of the world over about from the mid-1850s to the 1950s, quite an evolution. It was based on moving from sail to power. So again, we come back to it. A lot of, as naval architects, the kayak builder or the Greek or Egyptian builder, 2,000 years ago, was still the basic parameters and how big, how fast, how does it go. I was interested in the Norwegian measurement of a dimension. That, of course, was the Norwegians are known to be cheap, and I can say that because it was actually the cubit, which of course Noah used. And so if I want a 5-cubic boat, well, I'm going to give you a boat that's a little shorter. You pay me the same money for the longer boat. So I don't know if that's true, but I could believe it. But again, economics, boats generally had to do a job. You had to catch seal, or you had to transport things, so that it's something we bear in mind, that lobster boats have to go out and go fast, but go in rough water. They have to have enough stability to do their job. So all of these things are the things we do every day. We formalize it into owner's requirements and specifications, but they're not so different than, so the Felucca, the Dago boat, was a traditional Neapolitan Sicilian boat with a lateen rig. Lateens were common in the Mediterranean, and still common. If you saw my dhow and you see, I worked in Madagascar, I think I mentioned to you, in the 70s, and there were boats being built there, dhow rig boats, that were still in the traditional Sinbad trade. They sailed, the master of the ship would buy things in the Arabian Gulf, sail down the coast to Mombasa, out to Madagascar, over to India and back on a trade wind route on an annual basis, and they'd been doing that trade for thousands of years, and they had optimized the lateen rig for those particular areas. So again, it was these designs were brought from the old world to the new, and they were in an area where they were not targeting a particular fish. They were looking at a range of fisheries. And so they looked at the kind of thing. There were hand lining and lamprey surround nets, a hand seine net. Those were the traditional roles that Mediterranean fishermen used. In the mid to late 1800s, there was competition from Asian fishermen who were actually targeting different species, but there was a kind of mixture there. The boats had to be affordable. They had to support the families. They limited refrigeration, so that was important to be able to go get fish, bring it back and sell it and go out again. The felucas were sailed. They were rowed standing up facing forward, and we see that in some Maine type peapods with specially adapted things, and lots of times you want to see where you're going, and that's not easy to do if you're rowing. And it's interesting too, if we look at the technologies that evolve in different parts of the world. Rowing is quite efficient, but you don't see where you're going. But lots of places never got there. They still use paddles, which in bigger boats is quite inefficient, but those kind of things are still developed. But anyway, the gas engines came in around 1900. Again, there was an evolution in gas engines. It allowed them to go further, get home quicker, carry a little more. So these are kind of variations. We talk of the clipper bow, and as that reverse curve, but there was quite a variation, as you can see there. There was not one size fits all, but the idea of the curved bow, and you still see if you go to the Mediterranean, you'll see similar hulls. And the same double-ended shape. So these were of a shape that fitted that particular fishery, but it was an evolution from their European parents. I'll just go through some of these. Price of a boat, $1,500 used in 1930. And as we all know, there's always a value proposition. What can I afford to the first cost and the operating cost versus what I can make with the boat? And we all face that in our day jobs. The types of fishery, floating lamprey net, basically a handheld surface seine net, also hook fishing, some hand lining, but also trolling, where you're actually moving the boat and have hooks astern of you, and some trap fishing. And here again we see this, and again in fishing vessels, and it was interesting you're talking about the peapod. I hadn't really thought about that, but I know early in my young years I worked on fishing boats in Scotland, and we were side trawling, and you used the roll of the boat rather than the winches to you would get the net up, and when the boat rolled, you'd grab some more and it would roll down. So I mean, a lot of it's like my example with the canoes. I mean, you can move a lot of weight with buoyancy and with a little bit of leverage and fulcrum. Trolling rigs generally would use outriggers on poles, but these boats were very adaptable. And I think we see that too, and lots of times we get into the scientific naval architecture age, we think we can optimize, and we have a lot of optimization tools. Lots of times, though, you find out that things change. And so these vessels, one of the reasons they're successful is they were adaptable. They had enough elbow room in their designs to be able to say, hey, things are different now, what can I do differently? And that's definitely a value proposition. We see a lot of indigenous activities. Early engines, they literally will kickstart that big flywheel. You started it by kicking it over with your foot. Make and break engines, so the spark, the points actually were the ignition inside the cylinder. Actually very reliable engines. And this is the part I don't know about talking, although you can tell from my build I enjoy eating, but I'm no expert in San Francisco seafood, but Chris is. And he talks about the sort of fish arbitrage. Basically, they're successful because they're able to provide fresh fish into a local market where there's a demand for it. But the reason that and he claims, and I quite believe him, is that you were able to take a readily supply of not necessarily particularly desirable food, but through the cuisine that was brought from Europe, you turned it into a higher value product. So this was one of the things that was successful, and I'm no expert in that, but I'll believe what he says. So summarize, it was suitable to the fish stocks at the time, but fish stocks change, as you know. Suitably sized for the traditional family. You can build something too big, it won't work. Too small, it doesn't do it. The deck layout gave you a versatility. Gear layout, the basic hull form worked. It was something that fitted the sea conditions and the coastal environment. Low cost and easy to build, and was a good fit for that local economy, and why we still see them afloat today. Traditional development through evolution recapitulates on the origins of naval architects. So I think this has been the theme of this, and I think you said it well. When we look at nature, there's lots of good lessons. We look at our scientific approaches, there's lots of good stuff, but there's a whole wealth of information that I think we really have only started to scratch the surface on. I think individuals have looked at it, but there has not been an organized approach to using that as a resource. So there's lots of opportunity. And I think it started through people have a passion. Somebody said, I want to look at peapods. That's great stuff, but there's more stuff there. But how do we put all that together? And I would certainly like to see the society take this as a challenge. I think we can. This is part of what we do. We are a professional society that wants to collect and distribute knowledge about technology in the oceans, and I think this is going to be an important part of it. Thank you.
We'll do one more set of slides here, and then we'll wrap up. This is a presentation that's kind of an admission of error on my part. I've had the privilege of working with the Alexandria Seaport Foundation, and we do a number of things, and we're building a couple of boats to replace a Potomac River dory boat that is in our icon. It's an indigenous boat. Characteristics are pretty specific and comes out of the lower Potomac region of Maryland and Virginia. And it has distinguishing features of a kind of a wine glass tucked transom, usually planked fore and aft. It's got an up and down vertical stem, hard chine, pretty easy to build with the local woods of that area, or the lumber of that area, and usually rigged to sail, although a lot of them were used under power. And so we built one in the 90s that became our flagship of the Alexandria Seaport Foundation. I'm privileged to be on the board of that organization. It does great work with young people and people of all ages, actually. But that boat was decaying over time, and we needed to replace it. The boat in the lower left is our Potomac, the boat that we operate at the Alexandria Seaport Foundation. This is a version that's in the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum in St. Michael's. And this is another version of a dory boat that's at the St. Clements Island Lower Potomac Museum in Colton's Point, Maryland. And that's a version of a Potomac dory boat at the Calvert Maritime Museum. This is a profile of a boat that we're designing to replace the 42-footer. The new boats are going to be about 30 feet long. And the old boat was built traditionally the way the indigenous craft would have been built, with white oak framing and fir or local wood planking, sort of carvel, but with a hard chine. Unfortunately, they sit in fresh water, fairly warm fresh water, open. It rains on them all the time, and it's very hard to maintain. And like I say, over a couple of decades, the maintenance on the Potomac is getting a little bit costly for us and kind of a nuisance. So we wanted to replace them with boats that would use modern materials. So we're building the new boats with plywood topsides and strip plank cypress bottom, and they're wrapped with epoxy and glass inside and out, and they have laminated locust frames. Again, the whole idea is that if they do get wet, they hopefully won't decay as quickly, and they'll be easier to maintain. And you can see in this profile, a distinguishing feature is, again, the hard chine, which sort of fades out as it gets to the stem. Lousy drawing, recovered, actually, the drawings were done by a gentleman from NAVC, and the crummy view graph here is an indication of the quality of the remaining plans, but this shows an interesting thing right here, which is that there's no chine log. When we were going to build with the modern materials and we're going to tie plywood to the strip planking, we put in a chine log. And the lesson that we learned by trying to do modern materials on an old boat style and trying to retain the look and feel of the old boat style, you can see here is a picture of some of the boats in the museum, which confirms that They run the side planking right down and run the bottom planking right up to the side planking and stiffen it up with some members there to make the joint, but no chine log. When we started building our boats, we needed a chine log. And the lesson we learned was that wasn't so easy to actually make. Because if, as you heard me say, we have a plywood topside that's developable, if you sort of unfold that developable boat and you realize that the chine describes a curve across that developed surface, what you really have is a curve that may be fair, but is fair in multiple dimensions, and you really can't get it out of a single piece of wood. So it was perplexing a little bit. So the guys are sitting there trying to figure out what the heck are we going to do about building that chine log, and they had to piece it out of multiple pieces of lumber and basically laminate the chine log together. And this is a picture of one of the boats coming together with the plywood top sides, the strip plank bottom, and the line of the chine, which again is curving in all three dimensions and couldn't be made out of a piece of wood. When you go back and you look at the original boats, there was no chine log in there. So we should have learned that lesson ahead of time. But the boats turned out fairly nice looking. We haven't quite finished them out yet, but they're coming along, and they seem fairly true cosmetically to the look and feel of the indigenous type, but we've tried to adapt them to different construction methods. But along the way, we learned some lessons. And it should have been obvious to us, I suppose, that fair curve that I drew in the lines plan was going to be tough to build out of wood in one single piece. And there's a couple of good books I'd like to commend to you. There's a really good one that came out just about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, by the gentleman that works at Calvert Marine Museum, Richard Dodds. Excellent summary of boats in the lower Potomac region. And then another topic for another day, perhaps. There's a lot of controversy about what to do with modern materials and whether it's appropriate to slap epoxy or fiberglass on wood boats. And there's some recent articles in Wooden Boat magazine that talk about that subject. But here's an example of local watermen down in St. Mary's County in the 7th District. Excellent boats, beautifully built locally. They're extending the life of their boats in a very straightforward way by ripping out the seams, splining them with epoxy, and then covering the top sides with epoxy. And they've been doing this now for a few years, fairly systematically on all the boats in the local fleet. They seem to be surviving quite well, which surprises me because I was a little bit of a naysayer when they were going to do this epoxy coating on one side. So again, it's interesting to see old construction methods married up with new materials and new processes and see where that takes us. And then of course we're familiar with gondolas, another topic for another day, unsymmetrical hull forms, ergonomic fixtures that suit the purpose. There's a lot of things that we can explore in this area of ethnotechnology. So that gets us pretty close to our time frame, but I'll just open the floor to just any other questions that you might have for the folks that have spoken today.